This is the opening page of the Sunny Acres website, which is the actual tutorial in Tutorial 3. As you noticed, we have a logo, and we've had an animated graphic. I'll put it back here. And we have a tiled background pattern. Now this type of splash page is not really that popular anymore, but it was several years ago. So if we click to enter the website, one of the first things we see is that our website no longer stretches across the browser screen. So we have it confined to a specific area over here. We also notice that we have some columns. So in the next class, we will actually look at how we lay out columns using the CSS float property. In this class, we will look at this concept of floating an image, where we can have text wrap along next to or float next to an image. We have looked at background colors. Now we will take a look at being able to customize our fonts and text to be able to determine what type of font we want, the size, how the letters might look, if there's any indentation. So here we have the Sunny Acres website, and if you notice, the pages are relatively consistent with respect to layout, although they do change a little bit. So let's take a look at the code we will be learning for this week. So far we have been looking at selectors. There are many different types of selectors, and we will be learning them over the next few weeks. Last week we looked at the element selector, and today we will also look at the ID selector and the ability to group selectors. So the element selector allows us to apply a style to an HTML element, and this will apply to every element in that document unless we have an inline style that might essentially override it or set a different value for that same property. The ID selector. We have already looked at the ID attribute as the means to set a unique value for an element. We can use that ID as a selector. The syntax would be putting a pound sign in front of the name of the value of that selector. So here we see ID equals head, which is in our HTML tag. And in our embedded style sheet, we see pound head. So we can apply styles to a selector. We can also group selectors. And when we group the selector, they are separated by the comma. We can not only apply the styles to multiple elements, but also to multiple IDs. If we think about our Sunny Acres fixed width, how that was done was by setting a width property. So in CSS we have the ability to set a width and, if needed, a height. Usually height is not fixed, it just is as big as it needs to be. But in order to have nice laid out containers, you generally need to indicate the width that you would like. So here we have an example of a grouping of some text inside a div tag. And we have identified that content using an ID attribute, and we're setting the value to fruit. So the div tag is a very handy generic container that allows us to group an element, and it's usually just for the purpose of applying an ID attribute to that so that we can assign some styles. In CSS, we have different ways that we can indicate units of measure. There are both absolute units and relative units. Absolute units obviously are fixed, and for screen-related measurements, we generally see pixels being used. Relative units, the EM unit, that is a relative unit, and we generally see that used for text, That way, if the user wants to adjust their font size in the browser, it will proportionally adjust, whereas with fixed units, the font size will not. So we see EM being used a lot for reasons of accessibility. So in this class, we will be looking at some font and text styles. The font family is the only property that allows you to have multiple values. And what we're doing is we're setting an order of precedence. So we're saying we would like the font family to be Arial, but in the event that the user does not have Arial, we will use Times New Roman. And if they don't have that font, then we'll just settle for the default sans serif font. So there are generic font types such as serif, sans serif, mono, space, script. And we can just say that, well, we want it to be of that type. Or we can specify a specific font family. Now, the reason that Times New Roman is in double quotes is because it is several words. So if the font name is 2 or more words, you need to put that in double quotes. You generally see the font family and the font size being applied to the body tag. So here we have the font size property, and we can use any unit of measure, and as I said, it is common to see EM, and then if we were to change it to say 0.8 or 1.2, it would change proportionally according to the default. Some other popular font properties: the font style. Now, all of these properties have various values. I'm using, for the example, the most commonly used value. For example, rather than using the I tag to italicize, depending on the circumstances, we can use the font style property set to a value of italic. The font weight property is commonly used to make things bold. It is the same as the bold tag. The text hyphen decoration property, underline or no underline. This is how we take off that blue hyperlink in our A tag, and we will look at that in tutorial 4. The text transform allows us to capitalize. The font variant allows us to do small caps. And like I said, there's an appendix in the back of the book, and also you can search on the internet for these CSS properties, because these are not all the values for these properties. Some other common properties that are used when it comes to laying out text: the letter spacing allows us to set a value for the spacing between the letters. And here again, this can be a pixel value, an EM value, etc. Word spacing, we can adjust the spacing between our words. Line height, we can adjust the line height. Line indent, we can adjust an indent for our lines. Okay, floating an image, and we saw this in the demonstration. How we do this is using the CSS float property. Now, in the HTML code, the image tag would come first, and the text would be physically located underneath. And the browser will put the image on the right, and anything that is coded underneath the image will creep up and float along top of it, alongside of it. We see the same thing if we were floating the image to the left, with the exception that the image is now on the left-hand side of the page. Now, at some point, you generally want to clear this floating or wrapping, and you do this with the clear property. Clear the right, clear the left. You can call this inside any HTML element a break tag. You will commonly see a break tag being used to do this. Okay, let's look at background properties. The background image property allows us to put a background on a page. Now, this doesn't have to be on the whole page. It can be anywhere, in a P tag, in an H1 tag, in a div tag. So that is something that we could not do with HTML. So here we see the background-image property being applied to the body tag, which means it will be the whole page. And if you notice the syntax, URL, and in quotes the name of the graphic. If your graphic is located in a folder, you would need to have a path there. That graphic can have quotes, it can have double quotes, it can have no quotes. It doesn't seem to matter. The background repeat property. This allows us to tell the browser how this background will be repeating. And here, for the example, I have it repeating on a Y, meaning the Y-axis. So let's take a look at some of the ways that a background can repeat. By default, it repeats all over. In other words, we have a little swatch of a background image, and it continues to tile across the page. If we repeated X, it would repeat horizontally across the horizontal axis. Repeating Y would go down the Y. No repeat. There would be no repeat. The background attachment property allows us to actually make the background so that it does not move. It pretty much stays fixed. By default, the background scrolls with the page. And I have some examples on the Google Doc handout that shows you examples that have all these properties. Lastly is the background position, and that allows us to actually center the background. Now, if you had a background of no repeat, you probably wouldn't want it up in this right-hand corner. It would probably look silly there. So you would probably want to use a background position, and in this example, it will be centered right in the middle of the page. It takes two values, the first value being the horizontal position, the second value being the vertical position. And on the handout, I have a nice table that explains ways that you can indicate background position.